Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Coaching the Bible. This is episode 238, season 5, episode 25. I hope you had a wonderful 2 weeks. It was a week away. The holidays were celebrated. The holiday of Passover, Pesach was celebrated. Other holidays are celebrated as well. And we skipped a week. We took a week off. Chance to refresh, a chance to breathe, a chance to take some time, a chance to hold space, the opportunity to really celebrate in a way that's most personal, most meaningful, most appropriate, and best. It was a great week. It was a great holiday. It was great to be with everyone. It was great to have everyone together. It was a great time to celebrate. It was a great chance to be away together as well. And I hope you had that opportunity too. Coming into this week, we're in the middle of our series on the leader within, and we're continuing that as well today. The leader within as a series is a concept of the inner thinking, the inner emotion, the inner space that the leader holds for themselves while it is that they're trying to lead, how they build and how they work and how they continue to mold and shape themselves as a leader in the space when they're actually leading at the same time, how they prepare, how they think, what they think about. It's an enormous set of ideas and principles that isn't born in a single day. And part of the reason why that's true is there are going to be days when a person is a leader when that day is hard. I would imagine many of those days are going to be hard. But some of those days are what you might call the hardest day. And how do you lead on the hardest day? And that is the subject of this week's presentation, this week's podcast, Coaching the Bible, episode 238, Leadership on the Hardest Day. The weekly portion this week is known as Shmini in the book of Leviticus. And as I mentioned, when we started the book of Leviticus a few weeks ago, there's very little narrative in here. There's 2 stories in the entire volume known as Leviticus. And so when it is the case that both of those come up, it almost forces the conversation to steer in the direction of those narratives, because the narratives give us insights into the characters and the personalities and the people, and perhaps we learn the most from them. That doesn't diminish or decrease the value of the lessons and the leadership and the skills and all that we can bring out of distilling and the principles that are in the book. But the narratives are what they are. And so in the book, in this portion, in this section of the Bible, we have the very famous story of the death of the 2 sons of Aaron at the day of the coronation of the tabernacle of the Mishkan, we mentioned many, many times in the book of Exodus. We're going to dive into there because that is one of the hardest days in the 40 years in the desert. So let's dive in together. The reality of a leader and leadership is that it's not just about strategies and systems. It is very much about showing up when every part of you wants to simply just disappear. And in this week's section, as I mentioned, we see Aaron again just moments after perhaps the greatest moment of his public leadership. He's been at this for decades as a leader for the people back in Egypt. He then steps forward as the number 2 man at the right hand of Moses. He's the speaker for Moses in Egypt. He's a power player. We saw him. We talked about him in the story of the golden calf. There's a lot about Aaron. He's worth a set of conversations because I think on some level, as much as he's a public figure, he does a little bit float under the radar. There's a ton that can be distilled and learned from the personality, the person known as Aaron. And here, the Mishkan, this incredible temple tabernacle that the people helped to build, that Moses helped to build, that Bezalel and Aholiab helped to build, that is now being consecrated. It's an inspired moment. The divine presence descends, triumph. Whereas before it was the divine presence on the mountaintop, now it's a divine presence in the camp. This place is open for business. It's ready to go. Everyone's excited. They fall on their faces. They're awed by the moment of divine fire. And then unspeakable tragedy. Unspeakable tragedy. His 2 sons Nadav and Avihu die suddenly and not so inexplicably. They bring a foreign fire. They do something that is beyond the scope of the ceremony that was to be done there. Inspired. They wanted to do something more. There's a whole host of ways to explain it. We've talked about it before on this portion in previous years, and they die on the spot. And so what was this highest of high moments is now this tragic moment in a split of a second, in a flash. And Aaron in that moment says nothing. He is silent. We talked at length about silence specifically as a power last year in season 4 of Coaching the Bible, specifically again on this portion. Aaron is silent. And instead of focusing in on the idea of the power of silence and how silence is an incredibly unique tool for a leader, I want to think about what that silence represents. The silence as a symptom of a larger construct, of a larger approach, of a larger method of showing up for the leader on some of the hardest days. Because I don't know that silence is the answer, but in the case of Aaron, because he's carrying everything at once, he has the weight of his public responsibility. He has the collapse from this personal high joy moment. He has an absence of clarity or explanation for what just happened. He has the eyes of a nation looking at him for something. Are they looking for his strength? Are they looking for his compassion? Are they looking for his emotion? Are they looking for his breakdown? Are they looking for his leadership? And so he doesn't speak, but he still leads. And so as much as this is about silence, I don't think it's about silence. It's about the moments when your identity, your responsibilities, and your grief collide, and what leadership looks like when there are no words, or when words fail, when words won't be enough to convey what needs to be conveyed in that moment. And this is very much about the leader within. What does the leader do in that moment? How does the leader hold themselves in that moment? Emotionally, spiritually, physically? How do they show up in those spaces? So real leadership, I think, very much shows up not when things are clear or when things are calm, but when everything really has gone off script, when everything breaks down, and yet everyone is still watching. That's very much here. And so ask yourself this question. You're a leader, as we talk about a lot in your business. You lead a team, you lead a company. You're a leader in your community, religious figure, communal leader, whatever that is. You lead in your home, and you're under enormous, unbearable emotional strain, pressure, stress, anxiety, tension. That could be grief, as is the case of Aaron. It could be something else. Financial struggle. It could be pain or suffering. Someone's going through something. It could be you're simply not where you want to be, and it's now weighing very heavily on you. Maybe you were working on something for an extended period of time and it fails. And now you're bereft. You're lost. You have no idea where to go. How do you maintain your dignity when everything else is basically shattered? How do you lead while you're grieving that space? And how do you know then, in the case of Aaron or someone else, when to speak and when to stay silent? When saying something is the message and when silence is the message. And so I think it's interesting to start here, this conversation around the difference between how Moses handles this moment and how Aaron handles this moment. Now, we've seen this a couple of times already in the Bible, and now we're seeing it again. As I said earlier on in this presentation and mentioned again a few weeks ago when we talked about the golden calf story, I do think Aaron is worth a much larger, more comprehensive study as a personality, because I think, again, a lot of what's going on with him as a number 2 maybe falls to the wayside. So he is silent. The commentaries tell us all kinds of things about Aaron's silence in that moment. Exactly what was the nature of that silence? Exactly how is it possible that he was silent in that moment? Rashi, the famous commentary Rashi from the 11th century, tells us that Aaron is rewarded with that when that silence happens, with a personal revelation where God, in the very immediate section after the story, speaks directly to Aaron, shares with Aaron something that typically speaking would go to Moses. On some level, then, Aaron's silence isn't just an emotional response out of shock, but it's actually a considered response out of restraint. Aaron could have done all kinds of things at that moment. Aaron's decision, his choice, is to hold. That isn't to say that he's not shocked. It's not to say that he's not floored by this moment. Everyone and anyone would be. It's just that in the immediate moment, his first move is not tears. It's not yelling. It's not moving even. It's silence. I want to say that it's some sort of an idea about his spiritual presence. He didn't protest. He didn't perform. He absorbed the moment. He stayed in the space of the public leadership space he held. Maybe he felt or considered that that was the right response. If the Rashi idea that he is rewarded for it is the case, then maybe it was the right response. But certainly everyone's eyes are on Aaron at that moment. If they can somehow pull their eyes off of what they just witnessed in the tabernacle itself with the death of these two deeply religious, deeply spiritual, deeply holy individuals, the sons of Aaron. Contrast that for just a second with Moses' response in that moment. This is not to denigrate or diminish or really anything other than simply to compare. Right after the two men die, Moses tells us and tells Aaron, this is what God meant, that I will be sanctified by those closest to me. Me is a capital F, that being God. It appears to be that Moses on some level is trying to comfort Aaron in that moment. Aaron's response there is utter, complete silence. Take that silence however you want as a response to Moses. And then later on in the section, when it's the case that Aaron's remaining sons burn an offering as opposed to eating it, the inner details of that is not important. And Moses appears angry in that moment. And again, if you look at the commentaries, it appears that as much as he's angry publicly towards the two sons of Aaron that remain alive, it would seem that he is actually angry at Aaron. Aaron's response is gentle but firm, basically says, would it make sense that we would eat this on this day? And Moses backs down. The Bible tells us that, technical error, that Moses heard and it was good in his eyes. So essentially, Aaron silences Moses twice, once with quiet strength and one with quiet clarity. And so what we have to appreciate here from the leader, and for you as a leader, is that when these losses strike, when pressure rises, people are looking to the leader for anchoring. They're looking for the leader to hold space, to hold things together so that they are given space and permission to react. Moses reacts in both of those moments. Aaron holds. Again, it's not about better or worse. It's about the tension between what might be viewed as an expressive leadership versus an embodied leadership. We need both expressive leadership and embodied leadership, but sometimes silence is the most faithful act the leader can offer. And so when you start to think about what's going on here, and you step inside the space of the leader themselves, we have to think about how does that work? How does the mind work? Where do leaders go in those spaces? It's not our immediate thought, but we're looking for something from them. Famously, in my own lifetime, remember 9/11, the way President Bush handled 9/11. The moment he is told about the attacks at the Trade Center, the look on his face, but he holds the moment. He continues to read the story to the little children there in that room, even as he's getting information in his ear that one building was attacked and then the second building was attacked. And then he leaves, but he leaves comported and composed. Take a moment here in Israel. After October 7th, the prime minister has been consistently castigated and criticized for the nature of his emotional response to what happened on the 7th, to his level of responsibility and culpability for the 7th, to the families of the hostages, to the families of those who were killed that day and those who have been killed since. There's a balance that has to be there. And the people are looking to the leader in that moment. And so in the moment of crisis, the leader is more than just a decision maker. They become more of a mirror or a container and the symbol for the people. Their presence is the leadership, not their words. And that presence, the ability to have that level of emotional mastery of how to handle that situation, is through intense and incredibly powerful internal discipline. Aaron's ability or Aaron's reaction in that moment, Aaron's silence in that moment, I will suggest, is not forged only in that moment. I think there's something that gets him to that space, that builds him into that space. It's an emotional mastery, I think, on some level. It's a layered and active process. Again, it happens naturally, it's organic, it's immediate, but I think there's something that builds to get the person to that space. It can happen randomly, I think, for sure. I don't know, or I'm not sure 100% that that's the case with Aaron, nor do I think that that necessarily has to be the case with most leaders. We can prepare for these moments. We can be ready on some level for these moments through a set of key psychological frameworks that help unpack what's happening when the leader shows up on the hardest day. Number one is something that's called emotional containment. Emotional containment is the leader's ability to absorb and regulate collective anxiety without projecting it out. It's not that the leader lacks emotion or that there's an absence of emotion, is that the leader is holding emotion in a way that stabilizes other people. In the case of Aaron, he is controlling and holding his emotion and staying silent. He's not shutting down. He's containing something that for most people understandably would be explosive in that moment. And in so doing, it prevents some further blowback or some further chaos that might come. It perhaps buys time and a level of calm for others to begin processing. That's hard. The leader has to do that. It's hard to do that, but the leader has to do that. And by so doing, containing their own, holding their own emotion, they give space and psychological space and safety to the others to react. Number two, I think, is what's called emotional labor. Emotional labor is the act of managing one's own emotions related and the emotional climate of others in the service of the role. You get bad news as the leader. You get a bad financial report. The sale doesn't go through. The project crumbles, fails, and the leader masks their fear to project some level of confidence, regulating their own personal grief in that moment to create the space of others. Aaron is still dressed in the garments of the high priest. He is just moments removed from this incredibly emotional and beautiful spiritual ceremony where the divine fire, the divine presence rests on the camp. And in that moment, everything that was the positive has flipped on some level to a negative, and the people are now looking at him, and he is now the embodiment of disaster and tragedy and grief. And it is the labor of leadership in its most incredibly sacred and perhaps sacrificial form to hold the emotions in that space, to manage one's emotions in that space. That's emotional labor. It's a very powerful idea. And the third one, I think here, from a psychological standpoint as well, is attentional control is the term. Attentional control is the capacity to filter the noise and focus on what matters most. And in those moments of trauma or chaos or spontaneous disaster, whatever the case is, our brains typically scatter. For most people in that space, they don't get calm, cool, and collected. They fall apart, understandably. And Aaron's silence might reflect an incredibly hyper-focused awareness on what needs to be done in that moment, how one needs to comport themselves in that moment, even when his heart and his mind and his brain are screaming in that moment. Like a surgeon in the ER, a general in battle. The emotion is present. The scattering is sort of trying to happen in their brain. And somehow they're able to hold it together, and their actions take precedence in the moment and overwhelm the scattering and the crazy and the emotion that's going on in that space. Controlling one's attention, appreciating the nature of holding one's emotions in that space. Powerful business. And here's one more. When people grieve, there is a variety of ways in which people grieve. And there's a concept called the dual process model of grief by Strobe and Shute, 1999. And in the dual process model of grief, it has two pieces to the puzzle of grief at the same time. There's loss-oriented part of the grief, which is the feelings, the mourning, the emotional pain. And then there's the restoration-oriented part, which is the functioning and the doing and the adjusting. Those two things are happening for many people at the same time. And for a lot of other people, one is happening while the other one is not. In the case of leaders, they have to operate in both spaces. They move between the grief and the responsibility. They move between having to do something and having to be emotional in that space. I remember years ago, pretty sure, an interview with Rudy Giuliani, years after 9/11, when he talked about how he showed up in public on that day and the days that followed, and how he handled himself in private. Now, dismiss Rudy Giuliani, the version of him today, and focus back in on the mayor of America in 2001. Almost positively talked about the idea that he had to hold it together in public, and in private, he had the space to break down. Because the great leader has to move between being loss-oriented and being restoration-oriented. Loss-oriented is the grief, is the emotion, is the pain. Restoration-oriented is continuing to perform, continuing to show up, continuing to carry out the task, even while the person on the inside is collapsing. That silence isn't denial. That silence is leadership. It's a channeling of the grief into meaning, into action, at least for now. You have to embody the space of the leader, even when you don't want to. You have to embody the space of the leader because everyone is expecting you to and needs you to. It's not passive. The silence isn't passive. The silence is a mode of operation that allows everyone else to move forward. It's a high functioning, incredibly sophisticated level of emotional mastery that is, I think, very much deeply human in the space of unbearable pain. And great leaders have to learn this and not deny it, but have to carry it with them for the sake of everyone else. You can look at wider psychology, the philosophy, all kinds of things. But this is a choice. His silence is a choice. It's a very high level of spiritual and emotional intelligence, an incredibly high level of leadership. So you as the leader, when you're working on yourself in this moment, in this space, and you're thinking about this, you're thinking about building the leader within. Because what shows up on the outside, what shows up in that silence, what shows up in that moment, what shows up for President Bush at the time of 2001, what shows up for Giuliani at the time of 2001, I don't think is forged in that moment. And it doesn't have to be. That sacred silence is not inaction. It's, as I've said, grounding yourself when the world is shaking, holding your presence so that others can breathe, choosing your words with real reverence and not just purely with reaction. And so what's the toolkit then for the leader in this space? What do we have to do to get ourselves ready for these hard moments? Because they're going to come. And so here's what I think. Number one, and this I used to do with students and I do with clients. Practice what I'll call micro presence under pressure. Think of it the following way. Everyone is going to look for someone in a high moment of anxiety, stress, tension, who's going to give them permission to be emotional, permission to be nervous, permission to be shocked, angry, anxious, permission to share their emotions and their feelings. And the most important person in that room is the one who makes everyone else feel seen. That person is you. You have to signal stability in that moment. And so when that crisis strikes, you can be still. You can be emotional if you want. I'm sure there is a well-placed word or four-letter word or something that you could drop there, which I don't recommend perhaps, but understandable. You need to be that. You don't have to be everything, but you need to be that. And so what can you do in those moments and in practicing it is you can make eye contact. You can look across the room. You can breathe, but breathe slowly. Don't say too much. Stay calm, not cold. You need to be present and not panicked. You have to acknowledge what's going on without giving in to the emotion that's coming with it. And so you train yourself as the leader in smaller moments during team meetings, during hard feedback conversations, so that you're ready in those moments. But when the big one hits, you really already know how to hold the space. I don't necessarily think it's true that when a leader says, I didn't know how I was going to react in that moment, and then they acted perfectly. I imagine and I expect that there have been moments in that person's life when they have learned already how to handle that moment and didn't realize it, and it showed up in the bigger moment when they needed it. And so when crisis strikes, you can go still and you can be present and you can be stable for everybody else because you know what to do. It's learned. Number 2, this comes from Coach Bill Campbell, who is the $1 trillion coach. I mentioned him a number of times. He coached all the most famous CEOs of all the biggest companies at Silicon Valley. And he says, feel everything, but don't act on everything you feel. You're allowed to feel pain. You're allowed to feel rage. You're allowed to feel heartbreak. But you as the leader cannot make that someone else's burden. They have their own. They're not the leader. They're not required to carry weight and water for everybody else in those moments. That's your job as a leader. So how do you practice that? How do you work on that? Practice, again, is in the quieter moments. If you have a few moments in a incredibly hard, difficult day to step back, write something down, step into a side room and let off a little bit of emotion. No one has to see it. You can create check-ins with trusted confidants, people on your team who really know you, who you can step into space with, and you don't have to let it out. They know it and you know it. But you do have to hold back when your emotion is for you and not for the room. And you have to know when it's personal as opposed to for everyone else that surrounds you. And now you have to learn how to channel this into the right space that's balanced. This is about choosing that sense of maturity, finding the right moment to share and not dumping your business in the room. To channel that personal into the space of the communal. And find the words that might resonate and feel good for you, but perhaps more importantly are the words that need to resonate and feel for everybody else that's present. Again, this is about practice. Number 3 here is finding rituals or things that you can do in a very quick moment that anchor you, that hold you, that pull you back in. I mentioned it from James Clear a bunch of times. It comes also from the Navy SEALs, very much as the case, that you don't really rise to the occasion so much as you fall to the level of your preparation, as James Clear, the level of your system. And so the idea that that moment's going to come and you're going to be amazing in that moment and you're not going to be prepared for it is a mistake. Prepare for it. You can build the default tools now that you know to, that you can go to, that you can opt into almost naturally, as I said before, for that space. Maybe there's a phrase or an object or some sort of the breathing pattern that you can lean into in that moment. Maybe there is the ability for you to stop for a few moments every day and just be silent or still. It doesn't have to be awkward. It can just be between meetings. It can be in the morning, early, late in the evening. It's some sort of a meditative practice where you can check in with yourself, check in on your mind, check in on your body, check in on where you are, how balanced you feel. As I said, I don't think Aaron got lucky, quote unquote, in picking silence here. I think he learned over time how to get there. Just going to add 2 more here and we'll finish it out. Number 4 here is, what's your core principle that's going to anchor you? So we can do anchoring activities, but when your values are clear, right? The famous quote from Roy Disney, when values are clear, decisions are easy. You're pulled in a massive amount of directions in these crisis moments. But if you've already decided, you already know what matters most, you really can lean into and you can lead without flinching. So what's that North Star for you right off the top? Is it service? Is it dignity? Is it responsibility? What's the thing that's going to pull you, hold you together, that's going to allow you to operate in a moment when things are all haywire and crazy. Write it down, say it out loud, live it, go through the iterations, go through the motions, go through the actions. So that again, when the big moment arrives, you're already in the space. And so you rise to the level of the preparation, not to the level of the pressure. And when you pre-decide what the values are, then you can act from within without hesitation. The last one, I thought I saw this somewhere. I think it's true as a coach's rule. I love it. And if it's not owned by anybody else, I want to own this. The best leaders don't fake it, but they don't bleed in the boardroom either. The best leaders don't fake it, but they don't bleed in the boardroom either. This is what I mean. You can recalibrate privately, but you have to lead publicly. You will have your moments to fall apart, but not, as I said before, in the space or in the moment when everyone else needs you to be strong. And so what you can do is you can prepare for that. You can know that, okay, this is going to be a really bad board meeting. This is going to be a really tough communal presentation. This is going to be a really tough local personal day. And then you're going to build in 5 minutes after to decompress. You're going to have your 2 or 3 go-to people who hold your space for your truth and your emotions without judgment. Spouse, friend, sibling, partner, whatever. And this is not about pretending. This is about leading. And this is not about confusing your honesty with public unraveling. I'm not sure it's beneficial for the world or for your people to see you bumbling, stumbling, and falling apart in them. I don't think Aaron is suppressing here. I think he is sequenced on some level. There's a time for leadership and there's a time for grief. And we have to get the order right. And so that's not in the boardroom. That's before the boardroom. That's after the boardroom. But in the boardroom, you lead in the boardroom. You lead in the spaces you have to lead. It's super hard. Leading on the hardest day is super hard. I don't know how else to say that. And so when the moment comes, and it will, you won't have time to rise to the occasion. You fall to the level of the work, the habits, the clarity, the values, the presence, the approach that you've already put into motion from before. And you can train it and you can work it. Aaron hasn't asked for this moment. He didn't ask necessarily to be a leader either. But in the silence that follows this incredible tragedy, he teaches something incredible that no speech can offer. Leadership is not always about having the right words. It is sometimes about becoming the kind of person whose presence is enough. To finish it out with a quote, as we always do, from Martin Luther King Jr. The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in moments of comfort, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy. That is coaching the Bible. That is the leadership within. That is episode 238, leadership on the hardest of days. I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, by all means, share with somebody else. Something that I said that resonated with you, by all means, let me know. I appreciate you staying with me. It was a very long episode, staying with me all the way to the end. Look forward to seeing you next week.